Get started. I'm going to be talking to you today about academic listening circles and developing autonomous listening. And I'm going to be covering these four areas. I'm going to talk really quickly about what autonomous listening is. Then I'll be introducing academic listening circles. What are they? How do I actually conduct them in the classroom? I'll be talking about the roles and the procedure, as well as looking at some outcomes and some possible further activities and assessments. All right. First of all, in order to talk about autonomous listening, I want to talk about what our students have to contend with to become autonomous listeners. And of course, we all know that there's a range of obstacles for students in listening. We know that there's a whole plethora of things that make listening difficult. But this morning I want to touch briefly on these three. Firstly, short-term memory. This is something that we all employ when we're listening. However, in your native language or in your proficient languages, you're able to employ a short-term memory that is actually a fair bit longer than when you're doing this in a language that you're learning. So this means our students' short-term memory is considerably shorter than, say, ours in English. Or I like to flip it onto the students with their native language. They're able to hold an utterance in their native language in their mind for a lot longer than they can an English utterance. So they have less time. They have, a matter of seconds of memory of what they've heard. And this means that for a long utterance, by the time you get to the end of it, they've already forgotten the beginning of it. So they can't make connections between what they've heard and what they're hearing now. Right? So connecting information is very difficult. Secondly, this mental map, which is basically an understanding of the system of language in terms of grammar and vocabulary, how it all fits together, which means that if you're listening and you miss something, you miss a few words, if it's your native language or a proficient language, you can fill that in automatically. You don't even have to think about it, right? For example, if I were to say, if blah, 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 blah dinner, then you blah, 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 blah dessert, right? And you can fill that in pretty easily and go, okay, if you don't eat your dinner, you won't get dessert. And that's natural, it's automatic for us. But for our students, they're struggling with all those unheard words, and it's just, it's just a puzzle for them. So the lack of, or the underdeveloped mental map trips them up as they're trying to fill in blanks for words that they didn't hear. Thirdly, cultural expectations. You all know that these are a huge obstacle for our students, right? When they're listening to a speaker who assumes that the audience is going to have certain cultural background knowledge, our students get terribly tripped up with these. It causes them to hesitate, to lose the train of thought, and it's very difficult for them to get back into it. Going back to my previous example, the whole dinner-dessert thing, right? If they heard, if you don't eat your dinner, you won't get dessert, they don't really necessarily understand the connection between dinner and dessert, perhaps, depending on where they've come from, right? Another example, a professor might refer to the fact that, Jack and Jill were at the altar, but Jack forgot the ring. And students who aren't from, a sort of a Western environment where you actually have weddings at an altar are not going to get that cultural reference. Instances where an audience will all laugh at something, right? Students can't understand why everyone's laughing, and they feel like they need to know, and they just get tripped up and they stop, right? So these are some of the obstacles to listening. There are many more. I'm not going to go into much more detail, but this is what our students are contending with when we're trying to move them towards autonomous listening. So, real quick, what exactly is autonomous listening? Well, it's that automaticity, that ability to listen in English as if you're listening in your native language, where you're not really even thinking about it. It's just an automatic process. And ultimately, that's what we want our students to be able to do so that they can go off into their contexts and be able to listen without the scaffolding that we might give them or without the support that we give them in the classroom. Okay, so academic listening circles, what are they and how do they help students move towards autonomous listening? Well, essentially, these academic listening circles are both an individual and a group activity that students do where they pay attention to a particular listening text with the goal of understanding it very deeply and with the goal of understanding it from specific points of view in terms of trying to overcome these obstacles. Things like understanding connections between old and new information or these cultural expectations. They're going to explicitly pay attention to these things in order to more efficiently, implicitly do this as autonomous listeners in the future. I also want to point out that they're modelled after academic reading circles, which were developed by Tyson Seaburn, who many of you probably know. All right, so what exactly is an academic listening circle? Well, basically, I take students into groups of 4, right? So I divide students into a group of 4, and each student gets one role. These roles are leader, discourser, analyzer, and exemplifier. And each student does one role per academic listening circle. So they only have the one focus. The leader, it's pretty self-explanatory, right? They're going to lead the circle and kind of run the show. They focus on more macro-level main ideas. They're going to be the ones who determine what the key ideas of that particular talk are, and they're going to move the discussion along. Discourser, this person is going to focus on discourse, right? Systemic referential discourse, connecting information both within a certain section of the talk or forward or backward within the talk. Third role is analyzer. This person is going to focus on unknown vocabulary to a certain extent, but we don't want to get hung up on, a multitude of words. But they are also going to be focusing on that cultural or background knowledge that the speaker expects of the audience. And lastly, the exemplifier. The exemplifier is going to focus on examples and what those examples are examples of, right? The ideas that they're connected to. And whether they're simple or extended examples. Are they anecdotal or are they evidence-driven? And what exactly what idea are they supporting? All right, so what I'm going to have you do now is I'm going to hand out something real quick. Oops. Make sure I've got it. Can you actually help me with this? Just hand those out. For each. Yeah, one for everyone. I'm going to play a short section of a talk, and this is quite difficult to... Where'd it go? Sorry. This is quite difficult to read, so I'm going to hand it out in person here. And I'll just pull up the talk. I don't need to do it just yet. Oh, that one. Okay. Thank you. And then press. Just hit spacebar. Spacebar. Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to play a short section of a talk. And as you listen, I'd like you to look along on the transcript and determine what areas students might focus on if they are paying attention to referential or systemic discourse markers. What areas might students pay attention to if they are focusing on cultural background knowledge? And what areas might they focus on if they're paying attention to examples, right? And examples and main ideas. So you might be underlining or highlighting or circling or any indication of those things as you follow along. Okay, here we go.
Curatorial staffing is female. Now you might be wondering, actually what is a museum curator? Well, curators are basically in-house scholars and storytellers for museums. Through their exhibitions and gallery displays and their lectures and books, curators tell stories about human creativity, ingenuity, and history. Now, I recall over the last sort of several decades of working in an art museum, I've noticed that also, happily, because many institutions value curatorial scholarship and expertise, curators also serve as the kind of pipeline to leadership. So I suppose you might be thinking that if 70% of curators are women in most art museums, and also curators are the kind of training ground for leadership, I bet you're assuming that there's a lot of women leading art museums in the world. But in fact, that is not the case. I also remember as a student watching the Royal of Art World feminist protests that burst into the headlines, led by groups like the Guerrilla Girls, who asked the provocative question in their 1989 poster, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? The group campaigned, and actually still does, against the scarcity of women artists in museums. And their protest still applies, not just to artists, but also to arts world leadership. A woman has never run a top 3 art museum, and according to attendance figures, those are the Louvre in Paris, London's British Museum, and New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. Altogether, these 3 have been running for about 630 years, and not a single female director in sight. If you look at the top 20 museums in the world ranked by attendance, you can see that there are 3 female directors, but that's just 3 women leading the top 20 group of institutions where 70% of their curatorial staff are women, and that staff also is the training ground for leadership. Now, if you think about
Okay, so there was our little listening activity. What I'm going to do now is just look at each of the individual roles that students would play in the listening circles and what they would be focusing on for this particular section. Right, we'll start with the analyzer. In this text, right, the analyzer is focusing on cultural background knowledge or perhaps vocabulary that might trip them up. Is there anything you might suggest that they focus on here? Sorry? Curator, yeah. However, note that this was in the middle of the talk, so perhaps curator was mentioned prior to this section. But yeah, that would be something they'd focus on. Probably it came up earlier because it's kind of the topic of the talk. Anything else? Yeah, Guerrilla Girls, right? That's a huge one. We've probably all heard of Guerrilla Girls, right, from the 80s and the 90s, but the students aren't going to know who they are. And all these names of the museums, although they were listed up there in the slides, so that was a little bit helpful. Yeah, right, so the analyzer is going to focus on these things. Sorry, it's a little fuzzy. They're going to focus on things like Royal of Art World, the Guerrilla Girls, the Met Museum. Words like pipeline or provocative might come up in this section of the talk as well. If the student is really keen, they may notice that pipeline to leadership has been paraphrased nicely here, defined as training ground in leadership, so they may actually find it defined right there in the text. So the analyzer for this section of the talk will focus on that background cultural knowledge. They're going to research it. They're going to Google Guerrilla Girls. They're going to Google the Met Museum and find out what these things are. And then they're going to bring that information to the class for the listening circle. Okay, next is discourser. What areas of the talk, of this part of the talk, is the discourser going to focus on? What's that? The connections. So I mean, there's quite a few in here, but in particular, we'd want to focus on these ones, right? The ones that actually link two parts of a sentence or an utterance together, particularly. But in fact, that is not the case. That's actually a really important part of the talk here. They have to understand the contrast, and also, in fact, that is not the case. What's that? So that's a referential discourse that they're going to have to figure out what that whole utterance means based on that is not the case. Further down, the group there protest these three. These are some more sort of referential discourse markers that would help them to follow the talk. So the discourse is going to focus on these, bring this to the listening circle and share it with their group. Exemplifier. What's the exemplifier going to focus on here? The examples, there's a couple of them, yeah? So we've got, first of all, it's a little bit of an anecdotal anecdotal reference because she's talking about her own memory, but she is referring to something that happened. We've also got this statistic down here, top 20 museums, 70% of the curatorial staff. So some evidence there, some examples that provide evidence for ideas. So the exemplifier is going to bring those examples and explain what they're examples of, right? The idea that these examples are connected to, and share those with the circle. Now, and the leader, of course, the leader is going to be focusing on that main idea. So the exemplifier and the leader will often kind of tag team off of each other. But the leader is basically going to summarize the idea that is given here. I'm going to just move up here. This idea that women are not making it to the top of leadership positions in the art world. Basically, that's going to be the key idea of this part of the talk. And so when the group is forming and they're in their little group of four, they're going to be talking about each section of the text. They're going to move through it just like that. And then afterwards, they'll move on to the next section, do the same thing. So they prepare this all for homework on their own, individually, and then they come to class and they talk together and move through each section of the talk. That's kind of how this works. So in the end, if they do this successfully, they're paying explicit attention to the things that are going to trip them up as they're trying to move towards autonomous listening. They're building their ability to contextualize what they're hearing. They're building their ability to follow these discourse markers, to negotiate unknown cultural knowledge, right? And in the end, hopefully they'll have a really deep understanding of this text, this particular text. And ultimately, we want them to be able to use that text in their context. In an academic context, they might need to refer to that text in a presentation, a talk, a seminar. They might need to cite it if they're writing something. And if they're able to recall ideas from this talk, that will be evidence for whatever ideas they're putting forward. All right, I want to just point out that I've got a quick link. It is on the back of the handout. This will be on the IATEFL conference website as well. But this link will take you to supporting documents. These are documents that I give my students in preparation for and post-listening circle as well. There are several things you can have students do after the listening circle as a way to sort of follow up. You could give them a comprehension quiz. I have them do collaborative notes where they kind of answer some questions and summarize the talk. You could have them do a number of things, but there are some documents up here for you to have a look at. Okay? Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now.